Go ahead and get back into Galatians, and one of the things we're going to say is we got partway through verse 9 last week in chapter 4. One of the things I was going to say that we're going to talk about in the beginning just for a moment here is we've talked a lot about context, and I really believe that most of the misinterpretations that I hear nowadays in churches are because of people not following context. And it's funny, I was sitting in choir and the thought of something came to mind. And I'm going to tell you about musically two of the things I've done. And I'm being totally truthful here. One time I sang a solo in Constitution Hall up on the stage. And one time I sang in the Kennedy Center. Now the context. Constitution Hall DAR called me down because their networks were down and no one was in the building except me and the other networking guy. And he was giving me a tour of the building after I was fixing their servers and said, "You want to sing? Sure, why not?" So I have sung a solo in Constitution Hall. Kennedy Center, I sang the Messiah. It was a Messiah sing-along, so changes things a little bit because everybody was singing in the Kennedy Center that night. But the reason I bring up those two events is because often we look at things and we don't look at the context, and the meaning is completely different if we look at the context. Why don't we go ahead and pray, and then I'll talk a moment about context, and we'll get back into Galatians 4. Father, we thank you that you're here with us tonight. We thank you that we can study your word, and we ask you to open it to us. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. All right, the reason I bring up context again is because it's very easy to forget we're still in the context of chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. We're still in the context of this is all about the law. And we still haven't left that. It's still part of a single argument made by Paul, which again, one thing that makes Galatians so beautiful is it's point after point after point of one argument that just keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. I believe most of Romans is that way also. And again, beautiful books from a logical standpoint. Last week we talked about Galatians 4:9. Let me read that real quick. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? Real quick, we already talked about the fact that the elemental things that we're talking about were probably the demons, the spirits they worshiped while they were in Galatia. But then the question comes up is, why is he bringing this up if the context is the law? What he's using is an example basically to say, look, just like you left these things and don't want to turn back to them, you've left the Mosaic law. You had nothing to do with the Mosaic law, and why would you turn to it? One of the reasons he's using these examples is because the Mosaic law wasn't natural to the people there. The Mosaic law wasn't, the Galatians wouldn't have known that. The Jews would have. Most of the Galatians would not. By the way, short break, those notebooks on the table, Margaret told me anybody that wants them is welcome to take them. Whether they want to use for this class or whatever else, otherwise they're going to get rid of them. They're just three hole binders.
They're empty binders?
Yeah, empty binders. So she said this morning to tell you guys, feel free to take them. So that's the reason he's bringing this up here as far as turning back to these evil spirits or whatever the stoicheia is. He's talking about the idea that you're going to go back to something which is totally worthless, which doesn't even apply anymore. Same thing would be if you turn back to Mosaic law. In addition to that, we kind of talked about that. One of the things I want to talk about, two things real quick. Number one, he makes a point when it says here in the text, but now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God. That's a very good translation. It really says that in the original, and you're like, well, why wouldn't Paul just say the one? Just say to be known by God or to know God. What he's trying to bring about at this point is that there is an actual relationship here where, think about it, where God knows you and can talk to you, okay? Think about it this way. God is not going to have the kind of intimate communication with a non-believer that he has with a believer. Will the Holy Spirit show people about Christ? Certainly he will. But the point is that there's a sin barrier, there's a holiness barrier that we can't overcome until we're part of God's family. Once you're part of God's family, he can talk to us like children. He can't do that before, and that's why he's actually making a point of this, to say, no, not just that you know him, but he knows you. And really, if you think about it, Romans chapter 1 talked about the idea that anyone should know that there is a God. I might not know who he is, but there's a God from creation. Well, so everybody should know to search for God, but to have God know us is a whole different thing. And I don't mean God's unaware. He's omniscient, so he knows everything. But there's a whole different level here because there's a child-parent relationship that doesn't exist for non-believers. They're creations, not children.
When I saw
Yeah,
it a
please.
couple weeks ago, it jumped off.
Mhm.
And then when you, in English, when you say, if you use this phrase, or rather,
Mhm.
it's almost as if you are fine-tuning or almost correcting.
Right.
So it's
Correcting.
like this supremacy of, yes, it's important that we know God, but what's really important
Right.
is that God knows us.
Exactly.
That's where something
Yeah,
happens.
exactly. That's exactly what. And I went to check and look at this in the Greek and say, is this really what he's saying? Because this really comes out with what you say.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what's being said in the Greek. It's a good translation. That's why I said it's a good translation. Sometimes they're not. This one is. So yes, it is him saying, it's important that you know him, but the real important thing is he knows you.
Right.
And not only that, if you think about it, there's also a place where Paul talks about us having peace with God, for example. Okay? Only a believer can be at peace with God. A non-believer cannot be at peace because the non-believer still has sin charged to him. A believer is the only one who can come with Christ's righteousness applied to us. So again, this whole knowing us, there's a lot to it. It's not just that he knows us and talks with us, but we can literally be at peace and be comfortable with God also. Doesn't mean we don't respect the glory and majesty of God or things like that, but it's more like when you're at a family dinner type thing, for Thanksgiving or something. You don't sit there and think, you're not bowing down on the floor and going, oh, great Father or something. It's more along the lines of, hey, this is a family. Yes, we respect the Father, but this is the family. And that's what I'm seeing here. Again, not to take anything away from God and His majesty either. All right, we're in Galatians chapter 4, verse 9 right now. One of the other things I wanted to ask, one last thing on this verse. Again, we hit most of it last week, but I just want to hit a little bit. Did you ever think about who would ever want to turn back to be slaves? Actually relates to what you asked me this morning, but that's a different story. but I mean, why does he even talk about them going back to be slaves on this? Why would someone who was freed as a slave want to go back?
They don't know what to do.
Don't know what to do. Do you know that back after the Civil War, a lot of the slaves in the U.S. went back to the people who had been their masters and plantation owners before that? Some went to work for them, some even went basically as slaves, even though they weren't legally slaves.
They weren't legally allowed to
Right.
call them
They
slaves.
weren't legally
There's no
slaves.
practical difference.
Right.
Really.
And even there was also programs to give to the blacks, some land and things like that they could farm and things of that nature. They were never accepted in the South, especially. Even people don't realize this. They were really never accepted in the North either. The North happened to fight on the side of anti-slavery in most cases, but it wasn't like the North was saying, "Oh yes, please send them to us." But the point is, even with giving them the land, they were kind of like, "Okay, we got land. Yeah, we can farm, but this isn't what I'm used to. This isn't comforting." And comfort sometimes going back to what we know, even if it's bad for us. I find that, I've done that myself at times. Not only that, but sometimes it's a matter of, if you look, another example was in Judaism, there were bond slaves, where you could be a slave, and I think it was 7 years or something like that. If you decide you want to stay with the person, they would bore an awl through your earlobe, and, you'd have this mark, hole in your ear, and basically by doing that, you would be identified as you are their slave now. Now, I think there were rules on how they could be treated. But there were people who, for one reason or another, whether it was income, whether it was money was owed, whatever, voluntarily decided they were going to become bond slaves to someone. So it's not entirely without precedent, and certainly something where people go back to it. It's funny, too, and thinking about ambitions and everything as well. When I was 4 years old, I already knew exactly what I wanted to do in life. I was standing at my grandparents' new house in New Carleton, watching them lay sod, and I realized that's what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to lay sod. That was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen, was putting sod down. That is something that I would have gone to at 4 years old because I was comfortable and it looked familiar and it looked interesting. Today, I don't have a burning passion anymore to lay sod, okay? As a matter of fact, not only do I want to lay sod, I also told them, evidently for my first or second Christmas, as soon as I was able to talk, that what I wanted for Christmas was a furnace filter. So I had my ambitions in give me a furnace filter and let me lay sod, we're set. I no longer want that, yeah.
I was going to say, so there's the idea of going back to it because it's comfortable.
Yeah.
To say that another way, change requires effort.
Yeah, it does.
And there's a lot of unknown there.
Yeah.
Right. So they could have been facing that as well. It's like, well, that's new, scary. I don't know what I'm
It is.
doing.
Yeah.
And I'll just go back to your
Yeah,
comfort.
it's scary, and because it's scary, you go back to what you're knowing. That's not uncommon among humans. Yeah.
The other thing I wonder is, Christianity, you're following Jesus,
Mhm.
and what he teaches us in the Bible. But you're also in a personal relationship where, you know, you don't know what he's going to ask you to do
Right.
tomorrow exactly.
Right.
And whereas with the law, it's all prescribed.
Yeah, exactly.
You know exactly what you're supposed to
Right.
be doing. I mean, you may not always do it, but
Yeah, but you knew.
it's,
I'd hate
it's
to
less
live under the law.
responsibility.
Right. I would hate to live under the law, but I would have known what to do and what not to do. Which is why the Pharisees became popular. I mean, they took it to extremes, and they added the Talmud to the law, which was, you know, again, it's massive, the Talmuds, the Babylonian Jerusalem Talmuds. But they added them as additional. We like this law so much, we're going to make more of it, so it'll be better and better. They were basically going to improve on what God did. Junior Holy Spirits just deciding we're going to tell the people exactly what to do. So, yeah, I mean, it's something where you're right. You go back to it, even though it's something you'd say to yourself. We would say, honestly, if somebody said to me, I'm going to live under the Jewish law now, I'd be, have you lost your marbles? I mean, what are you talking about? Yet, they knew it, and they went back to it.
Not just familiarity, though. I think
Yeah.
responsibility.
Yeah.
And,
You're right. Well, they knew what to do when I say they knew it. They knew it was
if
expected.
you know anything about existentialism,
Mhm.
they describe it as being forced to be free. You know?
Mhm.
A lot of people don't want to be free.
No, you're right.
Because then they have to make the right choice.
Right.
You know,
Right.
they,
And the other
they
thing,
can just blindly follow the king into battle, and if it goes wrong, it's the king's fault.
you're right.
It's not my fault.
There are some people that want to be sheep. There are some people that. It's funny if you read. What was the guy's name? It's actually an excellent secular book on psychology. Very popular book. Talks about 3 types of people, and basically what it comes. You got your prophets, your salespeople, and your sheep. Basically, I forget what he called them now. Anybody know what I'm trying? He wrote 2 or 3 books. Very, very popular.
Eric Fromm?
No. This
No.
this is more. Anyway, the point I was going to make, I have it at home. I'll look at it. It's actually a good book, even though it's a secular book. It's practical advice. But basically, he says the majority of the people are in this sheep category. I think he calls it something else, followers or whatever. And then you've got the prophet types who are going to announce the change and bring it about and everything else. And then you've got the leaders who are kind of going to administrate her and take it over and everything. But those are the minorities. Those aren't the majorities. The majority of the people, yeah, they're comfortable in the sheep role. And that's just, that's the way it is. One thing also to remember, Paul brings up here is, remember, everyone is a slave. It's only a slave, are you a slave to sin and Satan, or are you a slave to Christ? And not that Satan rules them, but are you a sin to the satanic kingdom and the sin, or are you a slave to God?
I
There
still have
is
a hard time defining being a slave to God, really.
being a slave to God. Well, that's what we are once we're born again. Now, do we always act that way? No, sometimes we're rebellious slaves.
I mean, maybe I gotta look up the definition or something. Like, I don't feel like am I wearing this? Sorry. I don't feel like a slave to God.
Yeah.
But maybe I don't understand everything either. So.
If you're born again, you're a slave to God, but it's a matter of are you acting like it? You may not feel like it. Sometimes don't take this personally. Honestly, there are times when I don't feel like a slave to God either. I have to realize I am. Let me say this: if you were a slave, let's take in the Old South, okay? And today you woke up and you said, you know, I really don't feel like a slave today. Would that have set you free?
No.
No. You were still a slave, even if you didn't feel like it.
I guess I need to know what the rules are, and I probably don't.
The rules are simple. God's king. God's your master. Period.
Yeah, but what does that mean?
So
What is it? It means to, go ahead.
Depends on what you're viewing, what slavery you're talking about.
Mhm.
Are we talking of these like bond slaves? This is somebody who voluntarily enslaved themselves to somebody because of something they owed,
Mhm.
versus somebody who was captured from
Right.
and taken
Right.
against their will.
Right.
So I think most of the time when we think of slave here, we're thinking of what we see in the South.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, people held against their will, tortured, and mistreated.
Well, that wasn't always true either.
Not
but,
always
but
true,
you're right.
but-
But
Yeah,
certainly in some
The-
cases it happened.
The ones captured in Africa and taken across
Right.
the Atlantic, that was against their will.
Right. Certainly it
But
was.
then,
Absolutely.
generations later, they were just born
Right.
into it, they didn't know anything else.
But even then, what I mean is wide variety of treatment by the people who owned them. But yeah, but I know what you're saying. It
Yeah.
certainly
And
certainly
so
was
that's-
something that wasn't by choice.
Right.
I'm just saying, if you're like if God knows what is good because He's God,
Mhm.
and you want to do good as well, like how is that slavery?
So if you think of the bond slave, somebody who is putting themselves in slavery because I owe this person a debt I cannot pay. These words should sound familiar.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm going to enslave myself. Now, for there, he's trying to pay it off,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is not what, I mean,
Right.
it breaks down therefore. for
Right.
us. But.
Yeah, I mean, I
But
can
he's right.
associate with feeling indebted to God. I can
Yeah.
understand that.
But once you become a believer, that's really agreeing to a slavery contract. In a good way, though. See, that's the problem is we've taken slavery and always see slavery as bad. Slavery is bad. I'm not endorsing slavery. Okay,
I understand.
especially on earth.
You don't have to explain to me.
But my
I've
point
already-
being is that if God is the master, well, that changes things a bit.
Yeah.
And it's real point. Let me say this. What I would say is, do we do it all the time? No. But God has the ability, and we have the obligation to ask anything of us, and we need to do it.
Yeah.
But
Now, do we do it? No. But we should.
what, what you said a minute ago about wanting to do good, wanting to do the things that God wants, you know.
Right.
It's if you're just doing them for yourself or on your
Yeah.
own drive, God doesn't approve of that.
Mhm.
There's some
Well,
example where, you know, people say, "Didn't we prophesy in your name?"
Those are not. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Those
Yeah,
are
but-
non-believers, though. But you're right.
Oh well.
Yeah.
On the other side of that, it's not like you want to do the things that you're against either. I mean, just because.
No, but
All I'm saying is that if you agree with God, and so I have a pre-thought about a scenario here, and I'm
Well, what I was trying to say is we have free will. God gives us
Mhm.
free will.
certainly.
If He wanted to treat us like forced slaves, He'd take away our free will,
Mhm.
right? So the voluntary part is required if we're gonna be in this relationship
Right.
with God.
Yeah.
If we don't voluntarily become slaves, it's like we're choosing not to be in a relationship with God.
And Paul's the one who brings up the slave analogy, saying this is what we are. We are a slave to Christ. See, it's the other thing too. Is we see the word servant and slave a lot of time in the New Testament. Okay. Well, they're the same word in Greek. The word doulos. And the point is, a doulos, it's a slave. Now, you can cut it any way you want to, whether you call it servant, slave. What we have this distinction of a slave doesn't have choices. The servant is the person who voluntarily works in the house and does this or whatever. That's not what the Roman did. They may have done that at times, but that's not the distinction in Rome. If you were a doulos, you were a doulos. Period.
doulos as well.
Slave.
Slave.
Yeah. So the point is, really, most of the time when you see the word servant in the New Testament, probably should be translated slave if you're going to culturally do it properly from the time it was written. Most of the
Slavery, and that we're familiar with in American history, is a good bit different than slavery
It is.
in the Roman Empire.
But even in the Roman Empire, you had a wide variety between horrible masters and
Sure.
yeah, let's face it. Some of the masters, what they do, you're a gladiator today. You're going to gladiator school, and if you happen to die, so that's the way it goes. So I mean, you didn't have a choice in these
Sure.
things. There were other slaves in Roman history where we see, he was made many were made house-masters. In addition to that,
They were tutors to the
Yeah.
aristocrat's son.
yeah, and in addition to that, some were even allowed to run for office, things of that nature. So there was more variety in Roman slaves, but it was always with the understanding that you were a slave to that person. You didn't have a choice in that, no matter what you were doing.
The way I work it out is like if you, I'm going to see if I can do this real quickly, but
Mhm.
if you gave me the powers of God
Mhm.
and I was served only myself, everything ends up destroyed, probably including myself.
Mhm.
Maybe not. Maybe I don't destroy
Yeah.
myself, but everything gets destroyed.
Mhm. Sure.
And that's the case for any human,
Mhm.
not the case with God.
Right.
And so the choice is I serve myself and everything is destroyed, or I serve God and everything is preserved and everything is good.
I think more basic than that, if you're a slave to God, you entered a relationship with God as His child. So that's the other thing too. It's a little different here. You didn't have typically your slave child in the Old South, for example. You were a slave and then you had children, okay? But you didn't have the mixture of the two so much, or at least they wouldn't be treated that way, even if they did end up being a legitimate offspring. The point being is, in the Bible, we are a child of God, yet we're also a slave to God. It's funny. This relationship between God and us is it's weird, let's put it that way. And I'll tell you why. I had to talk, when I first started teaching in Bible college, I had a chat with a couple of classes. I had a chat with the students real quick saying, guys, this is a weird relationship you're going to enter in. And when I was in seminary and Bible college and things like that, I had this same weird relationship. So don't feel weird when you're in it, okay? I'm your professor, which essentially is your slave master, basically. You're the person assigning the task, saying you're going to do it, I'm going to grade you and everything else. And by the same token, I'm your brother in Christ. So it's a strange relationship because you're teaching your brothers, but by the same token, you're in a position of authority. And you see what I'm saying? It makes it kind of a weird relationship. I see the same thing with God in that, maybe you think of him as the professor or whatever. I don't know, but the point being is he is the position of authority. He's the one who's going to decide what to do. By the same token, we're his children. And something else. Let's say that someone decided in one of my classes, well, I'm not going to follow those rules because that's not the paper that I want to write. Congratulations, you just earned a 0 or whatever, Actually, the only 0s I gave out were for plagiarism. That was common. But the point being is that, the professor is the one who sets, and I was always, good about it, and the students loved my classes. So, it wasn't like I was, a horrible slave master at that time. But essentially, that's kind of sort of the role that I see we get into with God, except it's more extreme, which is a good thing. And again, I'm more than willing to put myself into the role of being God's slave as opposed to, if it's a person, I get a little bit nervous. If it's God, a whole different story. One other thing I was going to say that you might want to think about here is that we talked a little bit about doing what God wants us to do as part of being a slave. I remember something very vividly. I became a Christian when I was 12 or possibly 13 years old. I know when it was and where it was, but I don't know the exact date, so I was 12 or 13, right on the border. And when I became a Christian, everything gets given to God, and I'm going to repent, I'm going to do everything, obviously you're not going to do everything right, but I'm just giving it all to you, and now we'll talk, okay? And it worked, don't get me wrong, okay? But then later on, sometimes you got like contracts with callbacks or something. Well, we'll bring this one back. No, I didn't mean that. You know what I'm saying. And my one hang up was, okay, God, I said I'll do anything, but I don't want to be a missionary to Africa. I ain't going to cut it over there. I'm not going to eat that food. I'm not going to eat whatever. I do not want to go to, or any of these primitive cultures. And it's not that I didn't like the people. It's not that I didn't care about the people. But and all I kept hearing is, are you willing to go? Are you willing to go? And I'm like, oh, crap. And I don't mean that a voice of God, but something in me was like, oh, crap, can we have a do-over or whatever, okay? It took about 3 years of just, frankly, putting myself through torture at times with this. And finally, at one night after church, I was by myself, and I was praying. I was like, all right, God, I hate this. But if you want, I will be a missionary to Africa. I was about 16 years old. And I don't mean a literal voice from God, but instantly, what I heard was, why would I want you to be a missionary to Africa? You have no tools or skills to be a missionary to Africa. I just wanted to know if you were willing. And sometimes I think God puts us to tests on things, not just are we willing to, are we going to do it, but are we willing to do it? And then it's like, well, I didn't want you to do that. I'm almost like with Abraham sacrificing Isaac. He didn't want him to sacrifice Isaac. Honestly, when I look at my skill set afterwards, it was like, why would I even think about Africa? I am almost the consummate American. If you know, culturally and everything else about me, I'm American. I don't try to be. That's the way I was born. That's the way I am. That's the way I grew up. Nothing in me mixes. I get along great with Africans. Don't get me wrong. But the idea of living there and working as a missionary, not only that, I'm fine with Greek and stuff, but I'm not a natural language person either. In English I am, but not in foreign languages. I didn't learn them when I was young. My point is, I don't have the skill sets to do that. And why would God want me to do something? And I do have the skill sets to relate usually to certain groups of Americans in particular, or Westerners.
The implications with God, I think, are a little different, but it's like, as God as my ultimate father, right? It's like, like I love my parents.
Yeah.
And I would never, and God tells us to honor them, and I want to honor them anyway.
Right.
Right? And so I like to do things that make them happy, and
sure,
they love God too, so I know there's not going to be any conflicts there,
sure,
right? So I see it something like that. I can't say I've had any nudgings to do things like go to Africa.
Right, and most people don't.
Right, but Yeah, and I don't know how I would handle that. I imagine God gets the better of you one way or another. But
I think I was nudged for one reason. Are you turning over everything to me or just most things?
yeah,
And that was it. Because it was the one, it was like the worst thing in the world I could think of was, being a missionary to Africa or something. Okay? And I use that as an example. I wouldn't want to go to Vietnam either, or, Cambodia or whatever, okay?
Yeah.
But my point is that was why I think what the test was. It wasn't to get me to go.
yeah.
But it was just, are you giving me everything or just some things?
Yeah.
And honestly, I still do callbacks. We all do. It's not that we never do, and there are times we do, but we still do callbacks. Let me move on, unless there's something else we want to hit in verse 9. Let me move on to verse 10. Okay, please, go ahead.
I'm
That's
really
fine.
sorry.
No, go ahead. No, I'm fine. I'm fine spending more time on it.
Let me get through the whole thing.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Speaking of context,
Yeah.
just previously in Galatians chapter 4,
Mm-hmm.
there's other verses, but then verse 7.
Mhm.
So you are no longer a slave,
Mm-hmm.
but a son.
Right.
A son and heir through God.
Right.
John.
Mm-hmm.
John chapter 15, Jesus is talking to his disciples
Mhm.
before it's close to the end.
Sure.
He says, no longer do I call you servants. And
Mhm.
I looked that up, it's the same doulos
It
word.
is. Same word.
No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends.
Right.
For all that I have heard from my Father I have made
Right.
known to you. So there's this juxtaposition
Mhm.
of saying, like, no, Paul just said, we're not slaves anymore, we're sons.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, I'm not calling you my doulos anymore,
Right.
you're my friend.
Right.
And so, okay, so that.
Yeah.
And so then, but the idea of being indebted to God and getting into this relationship with Him,
Mm-hmm.
so that we are doing what the Father wants. So that
Mhm.
in just in a few verses previous, in John chapter 14,
Mm-hmm.
verse 31, Jesus says, I do as the Father has commanded me,
Mm-hmm.
so that the world may know that I love the Father.
Mhm.
So he obeys the Father,
Right.
so that people will know that he loves the Father.
Right.
So if I take that and extrapolate, it's this relationship.
Yeah, it's relationship based.
That was this relationship that we get with the Father.
Mhm.
Is that like, well, yes, we're gonna do what he wants because we love him,
Right.
right? And
Right.
like we adore him. Like, oh, we
Right.
would do anything for him.
Right.
Kind of. It's the kind of how I feel.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, because Jesus is like, I don't want to go to the cross.
Right.
But if that's what you want, because I love you so much,
Mhm.
right? I will do what your will is. Okay, so there was the idea of
Sure.
not necessarily slave, but how we relate to God.
No,
but then there's
that's
these
fair.
other verses that clearly say we are no longer
Right.
slaves. So I was looking for the ones that said
Yeah.
we are slaves to God. I couldn't find that one.
I have
All
to
I
go
found
back, yeah.
was we're not slaves anymore.
Yeah, I'd have to go back on that. I think number one, I go back to Romans for some of them. But here's my point.
Okay.
I think you're bringing out what I was trying to bring out with this professor-student relationship is that it's a weird relationship because clearly we are in a relationship with God where we're His children and therefore we have a special relationship and we're not slaves anymore. By the same token, we are slaves in that He owns us. If you see what I'm saying. It's weird in
Well,
that...
you had said we enter into a slave contract, and so,
Well, yeah,
so
basically,
I'm
yeah.
like,
What I'm saying,
that's
by,
not what,
yeah,
it
what I mean
says.
by that is again, we're thinking of that in American terms. I'm thinking of it in terms of the slave contract. Essentially, is we're agreeing to follow God. Period. And when we become a believer, yes, God, I'll follow you. I believe only on faith through faith for grace and everything else. Maybe slave contract isn't the right word. Okay, but the point being is, essentially, what's happening. This is where it gets weird. Also, is that we are essentially at the point in time when we get saved, we're turning everything over to God, and then how are we supposed to follow God? By fear? No, we're supposed to be following God out of gratitude for what He's already done for us, which is kind of the exact opposite of what we think of if we think of in American terms of slavery. What I'm saying, I think it's almost. Maybe slavery, think of maybe not in terms, and I don't mean this in the painful terms, but almost like branded. The Holy Spirit indwells within us. We are His. We belong to God, etc.
We've taken His name.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
We've taken His name. So there is a relationship, but by the same token, I would say this. There are some similarities, but I would say it's very different from a husband-wife relationship. God is the superior one. I mean, let's face it, it's not like we're equal to God and therefore now we sit with God or something like that. By the same token, we're his children and he loves us and we should be gratefully serving him. But one of the motivations I've said before for serving God, it should come out of the relationship. That the relationship's the key to the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm saying we're a slave to God, I don't mean in terms of like, and again, don't think in terms of like a taskmaster whipping
I'm
us.
thinking in terms of the Bible says we are no longer slaves.
I understand that.
That's what I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
no,
in
you're
terms
right.
of. So that's why I'm
And
pointing.
what
That's
I'm
why I'm
saying, I
poking
think
at
that
it.
it says both.
slave, well, in this whole discussion,
Yeah.
there's at least two meanings to the word slave.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
talking one meaning, the verses you're reading are talking a different
Right.
meaning.
You find verses like those. I agree with that completely. But you'll also find verses talking about you're either a slave to the devil or a slave to God. So what I'm saying is they're both taught and they're both correct. It's just in how it's a weird relationship. It really is. And it's funny. I was exposed to that more as a professor than I had been in the rest of my life because I didn't think of it in those terms. And all of a sudden, when you're standing up there in the front of the class and you have the ability, really you're in the authority, but you wouldn't misuse it and you wouldn't do that. So in truth, what I was saying, were they my slaves? No, they certainly weren't. We were in a relationship. And obviously much more so with God. So I'm not disagreeing with any of those verses. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. We are not slaves anymore. And I think, again, what you have to remember, too, is what's really coming out there normally is we're not slaves to sin. We're not slaves to the devil. And we have a relationship now with God instead. And so when I say about being a slave, I don't mean, again, God whipping us or doing us to do things. It's that he essentially is our owner. I think that's a fair thing to say. So that's the slavery portion of it. I'll get right to you. But not in terms of, how he practices it, certainly. Because again, both are taught. And again, it almost comes back down to the free will or predestination debates. Both are taught. Both are true. It's a similar thing here with slave or not slave. Yeah, go ahead.
You pointed out that God is superior to us by a lot.
Certainly. Yeah.
And Jesus, being God, can have a special kind of relationship with the Father that we
wouldn't have the same,
really,
but
we can only have it through Jesus.
right, absolutely, yes.
And even then, we can't appreciate it as fully as he can.
I would agree.
But so, other than having the relationship through Jesus, I think slave is the only possible relationship you can have with a being that superior. Is that what we're saying?
Well, what I'm saying, I would not call those outside of Christ slaves to God. They're creations that are going to be punished for their sin. The Bible doesn't use that terminology. It uses slaves to the devil or slaves to the world.
There's the
or whatever.
voluntary aspect of this.
Yes, but
where
you're right. Yes.
You say, I want to have a relationship with God.
Right. Once you enter into that,
the only kind of relationship you can choose from is
is a slave relationship. You're talking with us with God. Yes. To be a child of God, you also make yourself a slave to God. Even though it's true, you're not a slave in the sense of, because there is a sense being used of the word slave there also, the way the unjust master type slave. Okay, in those verses there, that's really what it's pointing out. It's not like someone who is a distant person who doesn't care about you, who's simply using you. And see, even in Rome, you had both those type slaves. Because again, I can show you, you go back, we find gladiators, for example, as a good example. You didn't have a choice about that. By the same token, there were slaves that were treated darn good in Rome.
Yeah.
Now, that was not the norm necessarily, but there were. Yeah.
But they also had these big agricultural estates.
Sure.
With enormous numbers of slaves working the fields.
Yeah.
Which is similar to what we had in the South.
They did. That's it. But there was all
But
kinds.
that was one
Right.
type of slavery.
Right. But I'm saying, if you see it simply as, I agree with what you're saying. The only way to be a child of God is to say you're His. And when you say you're His, we're essentially turning ourselves over as slaves. Yeah. Now, even though that's true, God doesn't take it as distant. I mean, think about most slave masters. They would have been like, how much money can I get from you? How much can I work you without killing you so that I still turn a profit type thing, okay? That's not what God's doing. So that's what makes it different really is how God treats us in the relationship. And that's why God does treat us as His children and why we become His children as well. So, and again, when it says we're not slaves, in those contexts, what He's trying to say is This is not as a typical slave situation would be in Rome or something. And I agree with those verses. I don't have any problem with them. I think, again, you got to look at the context of what's being said and where, and that's why they're used in those contexts. We'd have to look at all of them more.
It was talking about the law.
Yeah.
Slaves to the law. Not
Yeah.
Rome.
And yeah, that's something, at times it does talk about slavery to the law, exactly. You were going to say something, or?
Only that it's hard for us to really understand God.
Yeah.
And
true.
if in that contract there was a human,
Yeah.
that would be a horrible contract.
Oh, I'd
But
be worried
because
about
it's
it.
God.
Yeah.
There's no problem.
Right.
He's not going to take advantage of you. He's
Right.
not going to use you.
Right.
He's there for the relationship.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, all the good things that come out of your life while we're here on earth.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, a lot or all of that is a result of God.
Ultimately, it's all from God.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, one thing, I went to a church many years ago, and they had a guy to speak. I don't remember if he was a member or not, but he came in and spoke to our group. I was in the singles group then. And he came and spoke to us for, I don't know, 6 weeks or something like that. And it was all about, I forget if it was Ephesians or what, Ephesians 5 or what, but it came out to be, there was a section where he's talking about, you know, I think it was husbands and wives, children. I think it was Ephesians 5, end of Ephesians 5, beginning of Ephesians 6, relationships, okay? And then he comes to the slave-master relationship. And he says that this is the same as our work relationship with our job now. And therefore we have to apply it to that. And I'm like, hold it, wait a second, hit the brakes here. We got a problem here. My employer, years ago I was employed. First 7 years I worked, I had jobs with other people instead of working for myself. It was, never did my employer have the right to put me to death if I didn't do what he wanted. Okay, never did he have the right to come kick me if he didn't like what I wanted. And not only that, as a voluntary contract, at any point in time, I had the right to say, that's it, not worth it anymore, I'm walking away. His attitude was a person does not have the option, if they're Christians, to quit their job. Because that was a slave contract, and therefore, now what he didn't know is that I knew some people. He was actually like he was a manager in a large company. What he didn't know is that I knew several people that worked for him who literally were in tears at night saying, I have this boss who's unbelievable. He's the worst boss you can even imagine. And he's sitting there lecturing all of us about, these contracts and stuff. Good example of, if you were in a slave contract with that guy, you got problems. You really, even though he sounded good, didn't sound good, even though he's trying to say things that sounded good on the surface, when you start digging into it, it's like, whoa, wait a second. So, again, it's something, please.
Well, so that's a good example of a bad master.
Yeah.
If you're a slave to sin, which
Oh, yeah.
everyone
definitely
is,
a bad master.
Prior to Christ, we
that's
all
my
are.
question.
Yeah,
Is
prior to
it-
Christ, we all are.
Is that the same thing as saying a slave to sin? Is a slave to sin the same
Yeah.
thing as
That's-
saying a slave
I'm
to sin?
careful about using that word, and let me tell you why. We often talk about Satan, the devil, a slave to him. First of all, not in the same way as in personal servitude or anything else. Secondly, when I use that term, typically, even though I do believe in the person of Satan, typically I'm referring to the satanic kingdom. I usually will say that instead, because it's Satan, it's demons, it's our own sin nature. You go on and on and on. Sometimes you can't tell which one was it. Well, who knows? Okay. So the point being is, I'm a little careful about it. I would not say it's the same in that way. I wouldn't say a slave to Satan. I would say slave to sin, yes. Slave to our own desires, yes. Slave to Satan, not in the same. Now, I will say this.
Sin is a concept. It's not a master. Or it's
Oh,
hard to
I know,
think of it
yeah.
as an entity.
Well, that's true, but on the other hand, it is something that exists when we do it.
It's
kind of
hard to
like-
compare.
It's kind of like an ideology.
Yeah.
A little bit. So if the idea of sin is when we do what we think is right and not what God thinks is right.
Yeah.
Or what we think is right in our own eyes.
So we're our own master. Then.
Yeah. Yes. But it's that way of thinking that we become a slave to, because that's.
I'm just looking for
and
entity to entity comparison.
Oh yeah. No, I can't
right.
get one
I
of those.
wouldn't do that.
So I guess it's God versus self is the closest thing you can get. Slave to sin is.
I think I wouldn't try to draw the comparison other than to say the Bible uses it, but I would just say instead, slave to sin. In some ways, I'm not going to go back into it, but this dovetails a little bit into the predestination free will debate as well, and I'll tell you why. The reason I believe we are slaves to sin is because we do not have the ability in our mindset to think of certain things until we become believers. Okay? It's not because we have to do every last thing or something like that, but it's because, again, is it in our nature to do it? And the example I've used over and over again is, you can have all the free Brussels sprouts you want cooked any way you want to, I ain't eating them, period. One thing I said is, as soon as I'm not a kid, there is never going to be a Brussels sprout passing down this throat. I don't care what happens. I'll die first. I'm not.
That's because
That is
you
the
don't
hill
like
I will
them.
die on, is Brussels sprouts, okay?
God asked you, are you willing to eat Brussels sprouts?
Let's not put it there. I know. Yeah, that's a tough one. Okay, I'll admit that's a tough one for me. Let me say this. I would say to God, yes, I will. But you also know I will gag and vomit when I do it, and that will be. I literally gag and throw up if I have to eat Brussels sprouts. So I mean, would God make me do that? I don't know. Would I do it for God? Yes, but it'd have to be a very, very clear message, and I don't think I'd succeed in it. But the point being is, again, I think the reason we're slaves to sin is because we don't have the Holy Spirit in us. We are unholy in our nature. I mean, in other words, it's our mindset that makes us a slave to sin. Sometimes we think slave to sin means we can't do anything good. Non-Christians do good works at times, but it's of no value to God. It's not counted as righteousness for them.
But Christians still sin.
Oh yeah, Christians still sin, but that doesn't mean we're a slave to sin. Let me say this. When we sin, we made that choice to commit a sin, as opposed to it was our nature, therefore we drug into it. Now we still have a sin nature, don't get me wrong. But my point being is, Christians have a choice about sin that non-believers don't in some cases, I do believe.
I can tell you there was a stark difference. I came to know God fairly recently, which is probably different from most of you. I don't know, but probably. So I'm very impressed when I see somebody of young age find God. To me, that seems like it's impossible in today's day and age because there's so many distractions. But I can tell you, like, before, it doesn't even enter your mind. Like, the questions you would ask and it's not even somebody, maybe, I wouldn't say necessarily non-believer versus believer, because I believed in God before. It was that He wasn't the center of my focus. You could ask me, do you believe in God? Sure, I believe in God. So what? Let's move on to the next thing. Versus now it's like, yes, and here's why this is really important. And, but sinning before, it didn't really mean anything, right? And now...
Well, you still knew that some things were right and some things were wrong.
Sure.
You knew some things were right and some
and you
things
still
were wrong.
wanted to do the wrong choice.
But hold on, but what I'm saying is, like, even some of the wrong things, like, you would defend them. Like, you didn't. There was definitely a missing piece that where, and this is probably why you got people that murder and don't care.
Well,
To them, because to them they're. And I can't say, I can't say for certain, but I think I'm trying to associate some things. That one, they're feeding an impulse. Like, for some reason, it does something for them. They're murdering somebody. Like, maybe there's some, like, what's the word? There's a bloodlust, I think is a word, right?
Yeah.
And that means, like, you're getting something from killing somebody.
Right. Basically, you're talking about a psychopath at that point, if they
Okay.
enjoy the kill.
Okay, fine.
Sociopath couldn't care less.
Okay, but
Psychopath enjoys it.
okay, all right. So, but all I'm saying is that because that person doesn't know God, they are able to make that jump, and I can guarantee you, if they ever turned around and found God, they would see where they were wrong before. And if they tried to do it again, they would know. Like, versus before, they wouldn't care. And versus afterwards, they know, like,
But
like
even-
if I'm going to
even
sin, I
then,
know
there
I'm
are-
going to sin.
there are
Like,
very-
I
yeah.
understand it.
There are very moral non-Christians who know when they're sinning. So you'd be right about that.
Because, to get someone interested in Christianity and the message of salvation, you got to convince them that they're a sinner, and here's what sin is.
Right.
Well, we
So
have
I
to tell
don't
them.
think
Holy
that-
Spirit has to convince
Oh,
them.
yeah, yeah.
I think that almost everybody has some concept
Yes.
of what sin is, right and wrong, and
They do.
And some concept of God. We see
and
that from
some
Romans
concept
1.
of God.
Exactly.
I agree, but I would say the biggest problem is that it is just not that important.
Well,
and I don't know how to phrase
even
that
if
right.
it's
It's
there are
different
people
than not knowing it about
Right.
it at all.
Right,
even
right.
if it's
I
They
agree, I
understand.
agree
Right.
they think it's not important.
there's a missing component, and without that missing component, you can't become a child of God. And you know, there's a change in that. That's when I say, does not being a slave to sin mean and I don't sin? No, don't follow me around because you're going to be disappointed. I guarantee it. Don't follow me around for other reasons too. That'd be creepy. But besides that,
You hear the drone whirring over?
yeah, exactly. We had some. By the way, we had some of those right before when it started. A couple days before it started, Linda's looking out front. She's like, "We got big drones 200 feet over the house."
Wow.
I still
And as
yet
it
to
turned
see
out,
them.
yeah, it turned out. Well, then Hogan saw him, and he's only like 5 miles from where we live.
Huh.
So yeah, they were actually running around there, and we don't know what they are. Whatever. I'm not going to try it. I have some ideas, but I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, I think unless there's something else in verse 9, we probably. I'm not trying to get away from. I think we probably hashed it out pretty well. Yeah, I know it takes a while. Let's do verse 10 and 11. I want to hit these two together because these are interesting, and these are when context is critical. You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Wait, what's he saying there? You know, if you took that out of context, it's like, okay, what's he talking about? For one thing, does that mean that we just celebrated Christmas? Did we screw up?
I think that he's talking about the, if we go back to the other context of the law,
Mm-hmm.
right? That they're observing all of the special days in the laws, and all the feasts, and they're doing all of that. Maybe even just like going through the motions. I don't know. But, and so he's afraid he may have labored over you in vain. He's like, I think he's thinking, he's like, I just got you people free from
Right.
this, and I've wasted all of my air. You know, like it didn't
Yeah.
mean anything.
Right.
Kind
And
of
now
thing,
you're
'cause they're
turning,
doing back-
you're turning to a law that you didn't even know before, which is even worse. Because they were, the Gentiles there would have been the demons they were
Right,
following.
right.
This, you're turning to the Jewish law.
Right.
What you got to look at here is, it's not that it's wrong to have a holiday or a celebration or a feast. What is wrong is doing it as a religious thing to follow the law in order to follow the law. Context is everything here. And the context is basically saying, you know, why are you now going to follow the law? Because he's not only that, think about it. He's comparing following these feast days and holidays to turning back to demons in the previous verse. I mean, it's not, these verses are connected to each other. So again, is he in any way saying that the law was unholy? No. But the law is now dead, and for them to follow the law, think about it also, why are they following the law? To please God, to be in God's good graces. Well, that doesn't do it anymore. You can't do that. There is no covenant, old to old covenant of the law anymore to follow so that God would, you know, please God with that. Once that covenant has been fulfilled by Jesus Christ, essentially, think of it this way also, when someone is going to follow the law, under the Mosaic law, and Jesus Christ has already paid the final penalty of the law, isn't it kind of like coming back and saying, you know that death you had up there on the cross and the resurrection? That was really cool and good, but I got some extra things we can add on to this to make it better. And it's really what it is. Now again, does it mean it's wrong to... Would I go to a Passover ceremony with Jews? Well, I've been to them with Christians and a Jewish leader of it and stuff. Sure, why not? But it would not be because I'm following the law, if you see what I'm saying. And as non-believers, I would expect them to, you know, in this case, they were believing Jews, so they were doing to show us the symbolism of it. But the point is, it's not the Passover ceremony that's wrong. It's doing it because it's part of the law and following it as part of the law. I believe it or not, I know, well, Jehovah's Witnesses are a good example. Not Christians, but they absolutely reject Christmas, if I remember correctly. Number of people do. I've met Christians who reject Christmas as an example. It's become so, you know, it's just about commercialism and therefore we can't celebrate it at all. Well, okay, you might have a point there, you might not. I'm not going to get on that. I'm not going to get on that tree
The
stump.
Puritans for about
you're
10
right.
years in 1600s.
Yeah.
They ruled England.
Yeah,
And they forbade Christmas.
you're right. Wasn't that under Cromwell?
Yes, under
Yeah.
Cromwell.
They forbade Christmas.
But the reason was because Christmas was associated with a lot of drunkenness
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
carousing and
Yeah.
not a whole lot of worship.
Right.
There was a lot more carousing than there
Right.
was worship.
Exactly.
Kind
And
of like now.
right. Yeah, exactly. Pretty much like that. Especially New Year's. But yeah, you're right. Christmas the same way. I go to Christmas office parties. A lot of them.
Yeah. Then the Puritans were out and the
Yeah.
Royalists were back in and.
Oh,
You're right.
don't even
Christmas
get
is
me
fine
started
again.
on, like, you know, Christmas is basically a pronoun now.
Yeah.
You know, they'll put Christmas in front of another word.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nothing here has anything to do, like, you know, Christmas movie.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Bull crap. That is not a Christmas movie.
Yeah.
That is a Christmas movie. That is a movie where people are getting married
Well,
and
Came out
doing
on
whatever they
December
want.
the 25th.
My point is, I do understand. Well, actually, the ultimate Christmas movie is Die Hard, obviously, but that's another. Point.
Okay, you got me there.
That's the Christmas movie is Die Hard. Okay,
But anyway, when they ruled England for about 10 years,
Yeah.
they just absolutely forbade it.
they did. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. One of the, yeah, they did. They absolutely forbade it. You're right about that. Let me jump for a moment to verse 11 and tie it back, and then we'll come back and talk about holidays a little bit more. Basically, why is he then saying, I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain? Hey, you summed it up earlier pretty well, I think. But what are we talking about here? Why is he even saying that? Okay, you can repeat what you said earlier, because you had it right.
Oh, I totally wasted my breath.
Right.
Why did I even bother?
Why did I even bother with? No, that's right. That's exactly what he's saying. Why? This is paraphrase this. Why did I bother with this? Why did I bother with you? And next week we're going to see. We'll go back into it more, where he really talks about how close a relationship they had. So, like, why would you do this to me? Why, you know? And if you think, have you ever gotten to the point of teaching somebody, whether it's a mentor, whether you're an official teacher or whatever, and it's over and over and over, and fine, you may not say it to them, but in the back of your head you're like, why do I bother? I mean, you know, when you get to that point sometimes, yeah, it's that's the way it can. That's what Paul, now the truth is, Paul wasn't really saying, I'm giving up on you. And he wasn't saying this to say, that's it, I've had it, you're done. What he was really saying was, this is the way it appears, I know this can't be true of you. You've got to be a better way. There's got to be a way where you follow this. Now, we got a little bit of time left. Let me jump back to the holidays for a moment here, because I do have a question for you I'm interested in your opinions on. Christmas is just somewhat debatable, but generally we celebrate. We did a cantata, from what I remember, and a cantata was fine, and I think it was honoring to God. No problems there. I think in our house, yeah, I think Christmas was honoring to God. It wasn't a big production like it used to be, but I think it was honoring to God and had God in the center of it. What about Halloween? What about the fall festivals that churches hold? Thoughts, ideas? Because let me say, this is not an open and closed case no matter what. I could debate either side of it. But I'm curious to what you think.
Halloween itself
Yeah.
isn't Christian.
No.
It's
From Sam Hain.
kind of pre-Christian.
Right. Basically, Halloween started in Sam Hain with the Druids, where they would take and build these giant racks and then put people on them, and well, they'd burn the dead sometimes, but they'd also burn live people in order to sacrifice to get the crops to grow. So they had a harvest festival then too. It's just a different twist on it, okay? And also to keep the evil spirits away. The point being is, clearly the roots of Halloween are evil. There's no other word for it. Does that mean it's still evil if it's migrated so far away from that? Is it just harmless fun? On the other hand, also, if it's not harmless fun, as a church, is it good or bad to have these harvest festivals, or whatever we call them, which still really are celebrating the agricultural product? But even if we don't call it that, I mean, I was at one church and I went along with it. We basically had to dress up as biblical characters and things like that, okay? Is that right or wrong? Because I can see the point of, yes, it's an alternative to Halloween to keep the kids away from it. By the same token, most people are going to say, that's just Halloween. We know better than that. And I'm curious what you think on that.
Yeah, I don't think most people know those roots.
No, but they don't know the roots. They don't know
And
the
even
roots.
if you did, like
Right.
if I take my kid out for Halloween,
Right.
I'm not celebrating people dying, being burned alive, so that
But think
to
about,
some false god or
think about
something.
most of the costumes. What are they? Ghosts and goblins and ghouls and witches and, yeah, not to say there aren't good costumes. Let me say this. I threw them all for a loop. I did the church I was the pastor at, where I was teaching. I showed up as Martin Luther, complete in the monk's outfit and the whole thing, and a cross around my neck and 95 Theses and everything else. But the point being is, I didn't have a problem with that. But there's also a part of me that was like, now we had trick or trunk. That's what we did, and we got a lot of people to come and see the church and everything. But even if they don't know it, that's not the norm with the Martin Luther cut. Most kids aren't going to their moms and dads and say, hey mom, I want to be Martin Luther for Christmas or for Halloween or something like that. Yeah. When I was a kid, I didn't know any better.
But
Sure,
even the ghosts and goblins
as a vampire and everything else.
to most people, those are all fictional things. Even the
Mhm.
ghost, there's no such thing as a white sheet that floats around.
No, well, even then, the point is, a lot of that stuff, even though they may be fictional, they're not good fictional.
Yeah.
You know, they're thinking in terms of, in many cases, we're talking about things that are demonic, and you know, whether it's
Yeah, but now you're tying in a real aspect to that. People do not dig. You know, like
Right.
if you look at vampires, I mean, and then you look at the satanic cult with drinking people's blood, like, and I think that's where the vampire movie genre comes from,
Yeah.
personally.
could well be.
But yeah, I mean, people don't know that. They're just like, oh yeah, somebody's imagination came up with these scary things, so that they can, you know, so that they can give us an emotional reaction.
Let's say you're
to
right.
watching something on TV or.
We're celebrating. You said scary things. Is that what we should be celebrating?
No, but you got a long way to go with regular people,
Think on
but-
these things,
Yeah.
scary things and goblins and witches, right? No,
Yeah.
my point is this: I'm not trying to say I don't know the answer to this one. I really don't. I think this is an area where I have to call this a Romans 8 area, where I have to say there are some things that I have problems with and therefore I shouldn't do. There are other things where, you know something, I can't say for sure whether this is a sin or not, so I've got to allow each, I can write to you, or I will allow each believer to make their own conclusion about it. The reason I went along with it at the church that I was at was because the church thought it was a good thing for drawing people in and thought it was a good thing, and I said, you know something, I can go along with that. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it personally, and I'll show up as Martin Luther. So, but by the same token, I was a little uncomfortable. I don't feel it was sinful for me to do that. But by the same token, I don't feel I have an obligation to go around and saying, you're a sinner, stop that. You're a sinner, stop that. Now, I'll say this. I have seen Christians do things where I had to go to them and say, do you realize what you're doing here? Yeah, some of them take it over the limits, I think. But most cases, no, it's not over the limits. But I would say this. Each believer has to come to their own conclusion on that. And you can have, again, this is funny. There are certain things that are not intrinsically wrong, which can be a sin for me, but not for you, and vice versa. Which people don't realize. It's a sin if you're violating your own conscience.
Yeah.
So, yes, please.
You just made the point.
Made the point. Okay, sorry. Didn't mean to steal your thunder
But
there.
I do agree with John. I don't see
Yeah.
anything wrong with Halloween.
Right.
I mean, unless you, are focusing on like satanic things.
Yeah.
You're just.
In which case you're lost.
And I'm okay with that.
You're in trouble.
Yeah, you're in trouble anyway, so go
Yeah,
ahead,
yeah.
continue.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Let me say this. I'm probably a little more sensitive for one reason, because many, many years ago I used to put out a newsletter primarily for pastors and police officers. Those are the two primary subscribers to it. And come out every other month it was. And the entire newsletter was tracking satanic crime and writing about it and stuff like that. And it was educating a lot of police officers and things of that nature. Also, one of the reasons it was educating them is because, and they read it, there were police officers who used to call me and ask me to go look at crime scenes for them. I did no charge or anything, I'm happy to do it. And tell them, what type of a Satanist am I dealing with? Is this really a danger? Because people, you ever heard Satanist? Well, there's many, many, many types. There's,
So before you get into that,
sure.
a lot of people don't want to know,
No.
including me.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're in a special category. That's a valuable skill, service you apply
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
police. But I don't want to know all those things because
Yeah.
then I'll start thinking about it.
Okay. Well, the thing I will say about that though is that you're exposed to a lot more than you might otherwise be exposed.
By the way, what you just said is one of, I mean, I would call it a satanic tool, but you could also say somebody who has, anyways, so there's a concept that you can make things happen by thinking about them.
Mhm.
Like, and I don't necessarily mean conjure them out of thin air, but that's exactly why we see, and I want to say specifically perverted concepts in movies, is so that they can have mass adoption. People watch them and they say, oh, it's a movie. But it puts that concept that they otherwise never would have heard about
Right.
in their head, where it's basically a seed and it can grow. That's why they start teaching garbage, essentially, to little children, because you're getting them at a young age where they're more impressionable, and they're not going to criticize anything, right? They're just going to be adopting whatever it is, whether they reject it a little or maybe not at all, but even as adults, it doesn't matter once a concept is there. So that's a good frame to have.
On a more innocent level, I was thinking, with the conscience causing you to sin, maybe then I'll feel like Halloween is a sin. If I know too many of these things, you know.
Yeah.
I'd
And you
rather
may,
not.
you may at a certain
I'd rather
point.
not know.
Yeah, you may. I did not think it was when I was younger. As I got older, I still would not call it a sin. But I would say this: I'm much more careful about what I will do for Halloween, and I certainly won't dress up as a goblin or a witch or anything like that. A witch wouldn't have, for me anyway. I'd been the ugliest witch in history. But by the way, there is one thing I will say you probably should be familiar with, even if you're just a believer on the streets. Okay. There is one branch, and you kind of hit on it a little bit. The New Age movement bleeds into this quite a bit. But there is one branch of witchcraft called Wicca or white witchcraft. That you should be aware of, because what they'll honestly, I've met some very nice white witches, very nice people.
And they also
And
put
they're-
that in movies.
Well, yeah, exactly. And what they will tell you is they're not worshiping with demons. They're making contact with these loving spirits and everything. They're all about the earth and everything else. Okay, that is every bit as much satanic as satanic rituals of anything else. They just don't know it. The difference is they're practicing something which is a satanic ritual, but they have no knowledge of it. So it's not a bad person doing it or something like that. It's not like they're evil for doing it, but they're being led astray. And actually, a number of people that come out of white witchcraft have said that they realized later they were actually dealing with demons specifically. And they do call up spirits.
And I was going to say,
Yeah.
it probably opens them up to being vulnerable.
It does. It does. Something I should say also that you might want to think about for children, especially if you're talking to kids. Not to say it's impossible, but I've never known of a child or an adult even being harassed by a demon or well, as an adult you may be harassed simply because you're doing the Lord's work. But I've never known too much being harassed without, or getting into it more, without a kid opening a door. And I don't mean that he's evil or anything. I mean things that, Ouija boards, incredible number of, I used to have to study serial killers as well. And you would be shocked the number of serial killers. Yeah, when I was a kid, I used a Ouija board and it told me to do these things. And it did this and it flew across the room and everything. Amazingly high percentage of that. So you have these certain doorways that will open you up. And that's I think what you're talking about there. Doesn't mean that, and that's a good example. I stopped playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends when I was at a certain point in time. I realized, hey, wait a second. This is glorifying too much that I shouldn't be glorifying. I would not say it's sinful for everyone, but for me, I couldn't do it. But Ouija boards, I would say, yeah, that's wrong. Ouija board was actually designed as what's called, it was designed in Baltimore originally, by the Baltimore Talking Board Company. And it was never designed as a toy. It was designed as a communication tool for witches to communicate with demons, specifically. I think it was 1890s it was released. And then 1966, Parker Brothers decided they were going to turn it into a toy, mass market it, and get it in the hands of kids all over the world. So up until then, no, that was a specialty item for witches. And again, though, that's kind of a doorway. I'm mainly saying it's not for us so much. I don't expect any of us to get into Ouija boards or things of that nature. But you'd be amazed how many kids will do that. Over at a friend, oh yeah, I was over at a friend's house and they pulled out a Ouija board. I didn't know what they were. I had friends pull out Ouija boards. Something told me, even as a kid, no, I don't do that, and I didn't. But I had a lot of friends who played with them and wanted to play with them. So if you're dealing with children, do warn them about that. Do warn them about some things of that nature that can open doors. Yeah.
On your holiday question.
Sure.
Let's see if I can pull this together.
Mhm.
So, non-Christians
Mhm.
celebrate Christmas,
Mhm.
and it has nothing to do with Christ for them.
In most cases, yeah.
And it doesn't bother them
Mm-hmm.
what the origins
Right.
of Christmas
They don't
Christ
care.
Mass was.
They say
right?
this cool thing.
Well, there
and
actually
they're-
are.
Okay,
That's
well,
some good origins too.
Yeah,
But yeah.
But from their perspective, they're not concerned with the origin of that. They're
Right.
looking at what it has become for them,
Mm-hmm.
and they celebrate that. For Halloween,
Mm-hmm.
there's, I guess, what the original was,
Mhm.
right? And then there's what
Yeah.
it has become.
Right.
So there's some similarities there. I think I agree with the. It's got to be between you and God.
Mhm.
Because it could be different for
Sure.
different people. Oh shoot! Oh, dang it! Hold on. Main point. Oh.
Might it have to do with
Catch it,
it?
Dave. Catch it.
Might it have to do with whether it's sinful for non-believers to do these things?
No.
Okay.
Christmas, I don't know if this is the main point or not, but maybe it'll get me back there.
Sure.
So we are not actually commanded to celebrate Christmas
No.
anywhere.
Mm-mm.
We're told to
Nope.
remember his death on the cross and his resurrection.
Mhm.
So we're not commanded
Right.
to celebrate Christmas. He wasn't born on December 25th.
Right.
The date December 25th, this is where your historians can correct me.
Right.
To my knowledge, I thought that the date was chosen so that it would be near some other pagan holiday that
Yes.
was going on.
Saturnalia. That's right. Yeah,
And
Saturnalia.
so they wanted a Christian. They
Right.
wanted an alternative. Right.
They didn't quite have alternative in mind, but yes, you're coming close.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So they wanted a Christian thing near this other pagan
Right.
thing.
That's how the date was chosen.
So then back to Halloween,
Mhm.
right? If churches want to provide an alternative to
Right.
keep people from getting involved in
Right.
bad things,
Yeah.
like it kind of feels like there's a little bit of parallel there.
Yeah.
Little, but Saturnalia explicitly worship the Roman gods.
And not only that, I could say,
Okay.
in truth, when the Romans made Christmas a holiday, yeah, they Christianized it, but they really brought in an awful lot of non-Christian stuff to get it Christianized. The other thing I'd say is this.
Christmas tree came from German paganism.
Now, let me
I
say
was going to
this.
say, evergreens don't grow in the desert. That's my
No,
favorite.
but let me say this also. I'm not trying to say it's wrong for a church to do that. What I'm saying is I get uncomfortable sometimes, but I participated in the one. I would say this, I can't tell you whether it's right or wrong. Let me go to another level on this also. There are times when something may be, I'll get right to you. There are times when something may be sinful for a believer, but not a non-believer. Do you ever think about that? The believer may know better and may know certain things and violate his conscience, where the non-believer has no conscience about that. And I'm not trying to justify non-believers, but I'm trying to say there are things, non-believer may well celebrate Christmas, and again, I celebrate Christmas. I have no problem with that. We do keep Christ at the center. But we put up a Christmas tree. Artificial too, because they come from the artificial forest, but anyway.
But the Saxons
Right.
worshipped
Yep.
these certain
You're
trees
right.
in the forest in
Exactly.
500.
Exactly. Now you were saying?
I just think it looks pretty. So
Yeah.
so take what I said
Mhm.
and now take the opposite side of that. So let's take what we are commanded to celebrate: Easter,
Yeah.
resurrection,
Right.
all that.
Egg
And,
hunts.
huh?
Egg hunt. Right.
Peter Cottontail.
Festi-
No, so that's exactly where I'm going.
Festival of
Right?
Astartes.
So we've got Easter where we celebrate Christ's resurrection, but what has it become to the world?
Right.
It's become this. I don't even know how Peter Cottontail came out of Easter. I don't know.
Because it
But-
literally was the Festival of Astartes, which was the fertility god.
Okay.
That's
But-
did the same thing.
Okay,
Springtime.
So this bunny thing. So if we decided to take something that we are commanded to celebrate,
Mhm.
and now we want to do something that is
Alternative to that.
an
Right.
you know, it's almost like going in the opposite
Yeah,
direction.
but-
Like
but
we
in-
would never celebrate the Easter bunny
Right.
Laying eggs.
on Easter
Right.
Sunday morning.
In
We'll
recent
have Easter
years, though,
eggs,
Easter
but-
seems to be fading away for the secular people. I don't see much Easter
Oh, there's still a lot.
displays. in
They still have the
stores.
Easter egg roll on the White House lawn. They still have a
yeah,
lot
They
of,
call
but
it spring break more often.
yeah,
Spring
but
break,
you're right.
yeah.
But
yes, because there's not another.
right.
And Cadbury's still.
There's no Christian
Yeah.
connotation to that.
Cadbury
Yeah,
wants-
yeah.
But if you think about it, I was gonna say, in truth, bunnies, rabbits are known for fertility. Eggs are known for fertility. It all goes back to fertility on Easter. Now, am I condemning people who do that? No, I'm not. What I would say this is, we certainly should celebrate Easter. I do it without eggs and without bunnies. Well, if you want to cook eggs, I don't care about that. But the point is that I do it without that. But I would not come out and start lecturing a church. Now, I'll say this: if a church had somebody dressed up as the Easter Bunny handing out eggs in the middle of the service or something, I'd be, hey guys, wait a second. I think this is crossing the line.
Cool.
But honestly,
That was my
I think this is an
that was
area
my
we
main
do have to
point.
have. We'd have to seek Christian liberty in this area. Okay, so I don't think there's a definite right or wrong spot, and I do feel that for some people, one thing is right or wrong. For others, as a good example, for someone who came out of Satanism, who is now a believer. Okay.
Why are you pointing at me?
One of them. Yeah,
Because they're a great
Sorry,
example.
yeah, exactly. No, but let's say somebody came out of Satanism. Okay, man, to them, they probably couldn't celebrate Halloween.
Right.
Period. But it's because of their own conscience telling them that also.
I think the lesson here is don't find out the roots of any holiday.
Exactly.
Don't do
The
anything.
less we know, the
Don't
better
learn
off we
about it.
are,
Don't
right?
learn anything
It's
about
too
it.
late for me. I've done.
Yeah.
I think it's different too. The answer, right, is different whether it's like you view the person
Yeah.
versus you also were talking about what the church does.
Right.
I think those two things
Yeah.
can be very different answers
They are.
as well.
As an elder in that church, I had to go and say, you know something, while I'm not totally 100% comfortable with this, I see why you're doing it, and I believe that, since the vast majority of the church wants to do this, we can go ahead and do that without a problem. And I could even attend it, okay? Would I have sponsored and started it? No, I wouldn't have. So again, that's something, guys, some things the church might decide to do that I couldn't do personally. Some churches might, well, I know this, my parents went to a church years ago, they had a bridge club, and they'd go and meet and had tournaments and everything else. I used to play in tournaments at Hopkins and things like that as well. And the thing I was going to say in the bridge clubs, man, the high school I went to, they'd have freaked out on that one. You got playing cards, are you kidding me? And my sister-in-law is the one she told me about, she couldn't play cards until the Washington Bible Scholars bookstore started selling Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the 4 suits. What I'm saying is on that, no, there are definite various limits on that, no question. We got to be tolerant, but by the same token, tolerant doesn't mean, celebrate axe murderers coming down the middle of the aisle or something like that either, or bunny rabbits or whatever. I personally, I think I'd stand up there. So, I think we had a good discussion tonight on holidays, and again, a good discussion on a couple of things, the slavery as well. We're going to start on verse 12 next week. I think we pretty much hashed out 9 through 11. 3 verses, I know, we're speeding up. Well, 2.5 technically. We did half a 9 last week. But yeah. We did 4 verses in 2 weeks. We're getting there. There are spots where we're going to go much faster, I think, in Galatians. This is not, honestly, Galatians 4 is a section where you've just got to say, this is really going through the deep. This is wading through the deep section. And it really is.
Well, we only got 6 chapters, so
Yeah,
we're like
exactly.
2/3 of the way through. Anyway.
Exactly. So, all right, anything else? If that's the case, yeah.
This Easter I'm very excited for because it'll be the first time
Yeah.
I tell my family that holiday is way more important than Christmas.
Exactly.
And I'll be telling them about the great feat that Jesus did because they don't really understand that.
Right.
Like the absolute, the bewildering amazement behind it.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. So I can't wait to do that.
Oh yeah, I understand.
2 years ago, I started actually reading from the Bible on Christmas.
Right.
And one of the things I realized is that one of the books my wife read out of is the story of Mary and Joseph, and it actually does. It doesn't concretely say this is how you get to heaven, but they do talk about Jesus dying for our sins and all that, which is a nice thing, and I'm glad that that's always been there.
Sure.
Hadn't really clicked with me. But,
Yeah, I understand.
But anyways.
No, that's a good point. And I will say this, several times I've done Christmas messages for churches. And when I had, one of the things I preached on, these several times that I've preached on in those cases were, without Easter, Christmas is meaningless. And we forget about that a lot. Easter is the critical holiday. Yeah. However, without Jesus being born, he couldn't have been the Savior. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't make any difference. Yeah, but it doesn't make any difference without Easter. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. Let me go ahead and close with some prayer, and then we can go from there. Father, we thank you again for your word. We thank you that we can study it. We thank you for the relationship we have with you, that you really are our Father and that we are your children. And that even though you do have ownership of us, it's not in the way that the world sees it. Father, I thank you for all you've given to us, and I ask that we go out and serve you this week, and ask this in Christ's name. Amen. One thing that ties in with that, which I thought about, is the phrase freedom to serve. Because Paul talks about our freedom. It's not freedom to sin, it's freedom to serve. So even though we're owned by God, that gives us a freedom to serve him that we didn't have beforehand. And again, it's kind of a way to look at it. It's a weird dichotomy. It really is. But I think it's taught, it's just weird. But God's allowed to be weird on things.